an old, weathered hand, its skin a road map of sun-drenched years, and hard labor rests on a dusty, leather-bound journal. A lone tear traces a path through the grime on a wrinkled cheek. They say the West was one with iron and steam. A voice raspy with age trembles, but it was the quiet acts of courage, the whispers of compassion that truly tamed the wild. This is the story of Kelly, a woman who stared into the face of fear, not with a rifle, but with a heart as vast as the plains themselves. It's a tale of a lost child, 100 warriors, and a choice that would echo through generations. The relentless Texas sun beat down on the unforgiving landscape, baking the cracked earth and bleaching the buffalo grass to a pale, ghostly white. For Kelly, the world had shrunk to the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the dusty haze that clung to the horizon. It had been a year since the fever took her husband, leaving her with little more than a stubborn resilience and a homestead carved out of the raw wilderness. Life was a solitary affair, a constant battle against the elements and the ever-present threat of the unknown. Her nearest neighbors, the garrulous O'Driscoll family, were a good day's ride away. Their boisterous laughter and unsolicited advice were a welcome if infrequent intrusion into her quiet existence. But today the silence was different. It was a heavy, watchful silence, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant hawk. It was on her way back from the shallow creek, a precious source of water in this parched land, that she first saw him. A small figure no bigger than a tumbleweed, huddled amongst the rust-colored rocks. His skin was the color of rich earth, his dark hair a tangled mess that fell into wide, terrified eyes. He wore a simple breechcloth, and a single feather was woven into his hair, the unmistakable mark of a Comanche. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the heat of the day. The Comanche were a shadow on the edge of her world, a tribe whispered about in hushed, fearful tones by the settlers. Stories of their raids, their ferocity, were traded like currency in the dusty saloons of dusty towns. Yet this was not a warrior. This was a child lost and alone. He couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 summers old. His small body trembled not from the heat, but from a terror so profound it seemed to radiate from him in waves. As she drew closer, she saw the source of his fear. A pair of coyotes, their yellow eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger, circled him, their movements a sinister ballet of patience and menace. Kelly's heart hammered against her ribs. She was no gunslinger. Her husband had taught her to shoot, but her aim was unreliable at best. The rifle was back at the cabin a lifetime away. Her only weapon was a sturdy hickory stick she used for walking. The coyotes, emboldened by her approach, grew more aggressive. One darted in its teeth, snapping inches from the child's bare leg. A small whimper escaped the boy's lips, a sound that broke through Kelly's fear and ignited a fierce protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. With a cry that was more of a primal scream than a coherent sound, she charged forward, the hickory stick held high. The coyotes, startled by her sudden ferocity, hesitated. She didn't stop. She ran at them, her worn leather boots kicking up dust, her voice a raw, guttural roar. The element of surprise, and perhaps the sheer madness of her charge, was enough. The coyotes, their courage failing them, turned and fled into the tall grass. The child, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror, stared at her. He was still trembling, his small hands clenched into fists. Kelly slowed her approach, her heart still pounding. She knelt down, making herself smaller, less threatening. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the wild cry that had saved him. "You're safe now." The boy didn't understand her words, but he seemed to understand the gentleness in her tone. He watched her with an unnerving stillness, his dark eyes searching her face. He was covered in scratches, and a nasty gash on his arm was bleeding sluggishly. Slowly, carefully, she extended a hand. He flinched, but didn't pull away. She pointed to herself. "Kelly," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Then she pointed to him. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He was like a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Kelly knew she couldn't leave him here. The Coyotes would be back, or worse. The sun was already beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. "Come," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll take you home." She didn't know where his home was, or what dangers awaited her for interfering, but she knew she couldn't abandon him to the wilderness. She tore a strip from her petticoat and gently cleaned the gash on his arm. He winced, but allowed her to tend to the wound. As she worked, she noticed a small, intricately beaded amulet around his neck. It was a beautiful thing, a flash of vibrant color against his dusty skin. It spoke of a loving hand of a family that was surely searching for him. With a sigh, she scooped him up into her arms. He was surprisingly light, all sharp angles and bony limbs. He stiffened at first, then as if a dam of exhaustion had broken within him. He went limp, his small head resting against her shoulder. The walk back to the cabin was a blur of fear and determination. Every rustle in the grass, every shadow that danced in the fading light, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She was a lone woman with a Comanche child in her arms. A dangerous and unpredictable situation. As she reached the relative safety of her small cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The silence of the plains was no longer a comfort. It was a heavy, oppressive weight, filled with the unspoken threat of what was to come. She had saved a life, but in doing so, she may have just sealed her own fate. The sun had set, and the vast, dark expanse of the Texas night closed in around her, a silent harbinger of the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. The child, whose name she still didn't know, slept fitfully on her cot, a small, vulnerable bundle in the vast emptiness of her home. Kelly sat by the hearth, the warmth of the fire doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day. Each decision, each action, scrutinized under the harsh light of her growing fear. What had she done? She had defied the unwritten laws of this land, the invisible lines that separated the world of the white settler from that of the Comanche. The morning brought no relief. The sun rose a blood-red orb in a hazy sky, and with it a renewed sense of dread. The child awoke with a small cry, his dark eyes wide with confusion and fear. Kelly offered him a piece of dried venison and a cup of water, her movements slow and deliberate, her voice a soothing murmur. He ate with a quiet intensity, his gaze never leaving her face. She tried to communicate with him using gestures and simple words, but the gulf between their languages was too wide. He remained a mystery, a small, silent enigma in the heart of her solitary world. Later that day, she saw them, a cloud of dust on the horizon, a distant, ominous smudge against the brilliant blue of the sky. Her heart leaped into her throat. They were coming. She didn't have to guess who they were. The stories, the whispered warnings, flooded her mind. 100 riders, their painted faces a fearsome mask, their lances glinting in the sun. A war party. Panic, cold and suffocating, threatened to overwhelm her. She could run, she thought, grab the child and flee into the wilderness. But where would she go? She was a lone woman on foot with a child. They would be hunted down, a futile, desperate flight against the inevitable. No, she had to face them. She had to make them understand. She took a deep breath. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She would not show fear. She would stand her ground. She brought the child to the doorway of the cabin, his small hand clutching hers. He too saw the approaching riders, and a look of pure, unadulterated terror washed over his face. He buried his head in her skirts, his small body trembling. Kelly stroked his hair, her own fear a bitter taste in her mouth. "It's all right," she whispered the words a lie to both of them. The riders were closer now, their forms taking shape out of the dust. They were magnificent and terrifying, a wave of raw, untamed power that threatened to engulf her small homestead. They moved with a fluid grace, their ponies weaving a silent, deadly pattern across the plains. At their head rode a man who could only be their leader. He was tall and imposing, his face a mask of grim determination. A headdress of eagle feathers cascaded down his back, a symbol of his authority, of his prowess as a warrior. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed on her, on the small child cowering at her side. They surrounded the cabin, a silent, menacing circle of painted faces and sharpened steel. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a silence more terrifying than any war cry. The leader dismounted, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked towards her, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze never leaving her face. He spoke, his voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air she breathed. The words were foreign, incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. He was demanding the return of his son. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest. She had to make him understand. She had to bridge the chasm of language and culture that separated them. She took a step forward, her hand still holding the child's. She pointed to the boy, then to the scratches on his arm, the fading bruises. She pointed to the east, to the place where she had found him, and then she mimicked the slinking, predatory movements of a coyote. She acted out the scene, her movements clumsy, and exaggerated a desperate pantomime of rescue. She showed him the hickory stick, the only weapon she had, and she reenacted her charge, her pulled desperate cry. The chief watched her, his expression unreadable. His warriors remained silent, their faces impassive, their eyes cold and hard. When she was finished, she stood before him, her chest heaving, her face flushed with a mixture of fear and exertion. She had done all she could. The rest was in his hands. The chief's gaze shifted from her to his son. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, a question. The child, who had been hiding his face in Kelly's skirts, peeked out. He looked at his father, and then he looked at Kelly. And then in a small, clear voice, he spoke. The words were in his own tongue, but their meaning was universal. He pointed to Kelly, and then he said a single word. A word that Kelly didn't understand, but that seemed to hang in the air, a fragile, hopeful bridge between two worlds. The chief's stern expression softened, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He looked at Kelly, a long, searching gaze that seemed to penetrate to the very core of her being. And then a new voice, sharp and laced with venom, cut through the tense silence. "She's a liar, a witch. She stole the boy for some dark purpose." The voice belonged to Charles Kane, a man whose presence in the small community was as welcome as a rattlesnake in a sleeping bag. He was a failed prospector, a man whose dreams of gold had curdled into a bitter resentment of anyone who possessed what he did not. He had always looked at Kelly with a mixture of suspicion and envy, her quiet competence a constant reminder of his own failures. He had ridden up unnoticed in the tense standoff, his face a mask of righteous indignation. He was flanked by a handful of other settlers, their faces a mixture of fear and suspicion. "I saw her." Kane lied, his voice ringing with false conviction. "I saw her lure the boy away from his people. She's in league with the devil." The chief's eyes narrowed, the flicker of understanding replaced by a cold, dangerous glint. His hand went to the hilt of the knife at his belt. The fragile hope that had blossomed in the tense silence withered and died. Kelly's blood ran cold. She was trapped, caught between the wrath of a Comanche war chief and the lies of a bitter, vengeful man. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon had finally broken, and she was standing in the heart of it with nowhere to run. The 100 riders who had been a silent, menacing presence now seemed to lean forward, their hands tightening on their weapons. The Texas sun beat down a relentless, indifferent witness to the unfolding drama. Charles Kane's words hung in the air, a poison that seeped into the already tense atmosphere. The Comanche warriors, who had been on the verge of understanding, now bristled with renewed hostility. Their hands, which had relaxed slightly, now tightened on their lances and bows. The chief, whose name Kelly would later learn, was Quanah, took a step closer. His eyes, a pair of obsidian chips, hard and unforgiving. "She lies," Quanah said, his voice a low growl. He may not have understood Kane's words, but he understood the venom in his tone, the accusation in his pointed finger. Kane, emboldened by the renewed tension, continued his tirade. "She's a hex, I tell you. She's brought nothing but trouble since she came here. Her husband died of a mysterious fever, and now she's taken Indian children. She's a curse on this land." The small group of settlers with Kane shifted uneasily. They were simple folk, their lives governed by fear and superstition. The idea of a witch in their midst, a woman who consorted with spirits and stole children, was a terrifying one. They looked at Kelly, at her solitary cabin, at the strange, silent child at her side, and doubt began to cloud their judgment. Kelly stood frozen, a wave of cold dread washing over her. She was being tried and convicted in the court of fear and ignorance. Her words, her actions were being twisted into something sinister, something evil. She looked at Quanah, at the fury in his eyes, and she knew that her life hung by a thread. She had to make him understand. But how? How could she fight against a lie that was so much easier to believe than the truth? It was the child who broke the standoff. He let go of Kelly's skirt and took a hesitant step towards his father. He pointed to Kelly, and then he spoke, his small voice, clear and surprisingly strong. He spoke at length, his words tumbling out in a rush, his small hands gesturing wildly. He pointed to the east, to the rocks where she had found him. He mimicked the snarling of the coyotes, his small face a comical mask of ferocity. And then he pointed to Kelly, to the hickory stick she still held, and he made a sweeping, heroic gesture. Quanah listened, his stern expression slowly softening. He looked at his son, and then he looked at Kelly. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a look of confusion, of dawning understanding. Cain, seeing his influence slipping away, grew desperate. "Don't listen to the boy, he's bewitched. She's cast a spell on him." But his words had lost their power. The settlers, seeing the child's earnest reenactment, began to murmur amongst themselves. The story he told, a story of courage and rescue, was a much more believable one than Cain's tale of witchcraft and devilry. Quanah knelt down and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. He spoke to him in a low, gentle voice, and the boy answered his voice filled with a childish earnestness. After a long moment, Quanah stood up. He looked at Kelly, and then he did something that stunned everyone into silence. He raised his hand not in a threat, but in a gesture of respect. He spoke, his voice no longer a growl, but a deep, resonant rumble. A young warrior, who had been standing silently behind Quanah, stepped forward. He spoke in broken English, his voice hesitant but clear. He said, "You have the heart of a warrior. You save his son. Thank you." A wave of relief so profound it almost brought her to her knees, washed over Kelly. She had been heard. The truth had prevailed. But Cain was not a man to be so easily defeated. His face contorted with rage, and humiliation was a terrifying sight. "She's a traitor!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "She's siding with the savages against her own kind. She's a danger to us all." He lunged at her, his eyes wild with a crazed, desperate hatred. But he never reached her. Quanah, with a speed that belied his size, stepped between them. He grabbed Cain by the front of his shirt and lifted him off the ground, his feet dangling inches from the dusty earth. Quanah's face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He spoke, his voice a low, deadly whisper. The young warrior translated his voice, trembling slightly. He said, "You are a man with a snake's tongue. You speak with lies and poison. You are not welcome here." Quanah threw Cain to the ground, his body landing in a heap of dust and humiliation. He turned to the other settlers, his gaze sweeping over their fearful faces. "Go," he said, the single word, a command that needed no translation. The settlers, their courage deserting them, scrambled to obey. They helped a dazed and sputtering Cain to his feet and beat a hasty retreat, their departure a cloud of dust and shame. The plains were quiet once more, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind through the tall grass. Quanah turned to Kelly, his expression one of weary respect. He gestured to the amulet around his son's neck, and then he touched his own chest. "My son," he said, the words a simple statement of fact, but filled with a world of meaning. "Takoda." He then pointed to Kelly, a question in his eyes. "Kelly," she said, her voice a little shaky. He repeated her name, the sound a little strange on his tongue, but recognizable. He then turned and gestured to the vast open plains. "My home," he said. He then pointed to her cabin. "Your home." He placed a hand over his heart, and then he gestured from his home to hers. The message was clear. There was a bridge between them now, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of fear and misunderstanding. He turned to leave his warriors, parting to let him through. But before he mounted his pony, he stopped and looked back at her. He spoke one last time, his voice a low, solemn promise. The young warrior translated. He said, "You are a friend to the Comanche. You will not be forgotten." And then they were gone, a silent, departing wave of painted faces and feathered headdresses. Kelly stood in the doorway of her cabin, the small boy, Takoda, still holding her hand. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land. The storm had passed, but she knew that the world had changed. The invisible lines that had once separated her world from that of the Comanche had been redrawn. She was no longer just a solitary settler, a widow struggling to survive on the harsh frontier. She was Kelly, the woman who had saved a Comanche child, the woman who had stared down 100 riders and lived to tell the tale. She was a friend to the Comanche. And in the wild, unforgiving heart of the West, that was a title that carried more weight than gold, more power than a gun. It was a title that would shape her destiny in ways she could not yet imagine. The days that followed were filled with a strange, unnerving quiet. The vast emptiness of the plains, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like a void. The memory of the 100 riders of Quanah's stoic face of Cain's venomous accusations was a constant, unsettling presence. Kelly tried to return to her routine, to the familiar rhythm of her solitary life. But everything had changed. The world felt different, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a reality she had never known existed. She was no longer just a settler, an intruder in a land that had belonged to others for centuries. She was a part of its story, a character in a drama that was still unfolding. A week after the encounter with Quanah, a group of Comanche warriors appeared on the horizon. They were not a war party, but a small delegation of 4 riders. They stopped a respectful distance from her cabin and waited. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to expect. Was this a test? A threat? A continuation of the drama that had played out on her doorstep? She took a deep breath and walked out to meet them. The lead warrior, the same young man who had translated for Quanah, dismounted and approached her. He carried a large buckskin-wrapped bundle. Kelly, he said, his pronunciation of her name still a little hesitant. He held out the bundle. A gift. From Quanah, she took the bundle, her hands trembling slightly. It was heavy, and a faint, sweet smell emanated from it. She carefully unwrapped it, revealing a beautifully tanned buffalo robe, its fur thick and soft. Beneath it were several pouches of dried meat, a small bag of medicinal herbs, and a stunningly intricate piece of beadwork, a testament to the skill and artistry of the Comanche people. Tears welled in her eyes. It was a gift of immense value, a symbol of gratitude, of respect. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. The warrior nodded. "Quanah Sai, you are one of us now. You have a place in our hearts." He then gestured to the east, to the direction from which they had come. "He invite you to our camp, to share a meal, to be our guest." Kelly was stunned. An invitation to a Comanche camp was an unheard-of honor for a white settler. It was a gesture of trust, of friendship that went far beyond anything she could have imagined. But it was also a dangerous proposition. The world of the Comanche was a world of which she knew nothing. It was a world of different customs, different beliefs, a world that was viewed with fear and suspicion by her own people. To accept the invitation would be to cross a line, to enter a world from which she might not be able to return. And what about Cain? He was still out there, his hatred a festering wound. He would see her visit to the Comanche camp as a betrayal, as further proof of her supposed treachery. He would use it to turn the other settlers against her, to paint her as a traitor, an enemy of her own kind. She looked at the young warrior, at his open, honest face, and she knew she had to accept. To refuse would be to reject the hand of friendship that had been extended to her, to dishonor the trust that had been so hard won. "I will come," she said, her voice firm, resolute. The warrior's face broke into a wide smile. "We will be honored," he said. They agreed on a day 3 suns from now, and then the warriors departed, leaving Kelly alone with her thoughts, with the weight of her decision. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and anticipation. She prepared for her visit, mending her best dress, a simple calico gown that seemed wholly inadequate for the occasion. She baked a small loaf of bread, a humble offering to a people who had given her so much. On the appointed day, she set out on foot, her heart aflutter, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The journey to the Comanche camp was a long one, a walk through a landscape that was both beautiful and hostile. She followed the directions the warrior had given her, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her ears attuned to every sound. As she drew closer to the camp, she could hear the sounds of life, the laughter of children, the barking of dogs, the low murmur of voices. The camp was a sprawling collection of teepees, their painted hides a vibrant splash of color against the muted tones of the plains. A group of children, their faces alight with curiosity, ran out to meet her. They surrounded her, their dark eyes wide with wonder. They touched her dress, her hair, their laughter a joyful, infectious sound. An older woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, shooed the children away. She greeted Kelly with a warm, welcoming smile and led her into the camp. The camp was a hive of activity. Women were tanning hides, mending clothes, preparing food. Men were mending weapons, tending to their ponies, their voices a low, rhythmic hum. It was a world of community, of family, a world that was a stark contrast to her own solitary existence. She was led to a large teepee in the center of the camp, the teepee of the chief. Quanah was waiting for her. He was not the fearsome warrior she had met on her doorstep, but a gracious host. His face alight with a warm, welcoming smile. He introduced her to his wife, a beautiful woman with kind, intelligent eyes, and to his son, Takoda, who ran to her and hugged her legs, a gesture of pure, unadulterated affection. They shared a meal, a simple but delicious stew of venison and wild vegetables. They talked with the help of the young warrior, who had become their unofficial translator. Kelly told them about her life, about her husband, about her solitary existence on the plains. Quanah told her about his people, about their struggles, their traditions, their deep connection to the land. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the camp, a sense of peace settled over Kelly. She was no longer an outsider, a stranger in a foreign land. She was a guest, a friend, a part of something larger than herself. But the peace was short-lived. A scout, his face grim, rode into the camp. He spoke to Quanah in a low, urgent voice. Quanah's face darkened, his expression one of grave concern. He turned to Kelly, his voice low and serious. The young warrior translated. He said, "A rider is coming, a white man. He is not a friend." Kelly's heart sank. She knew who it was. It was Cain. He had followed her. He had come to destroy the fragile peace she had found, to turn her world upside down once more. The uneasy peace had been shattered, and the storm was about to break again this time, with a fury she could not have imagined. The news of Cain's approach cast a pall over the Comanche camp. The joyful sounds of laughter and conversation were replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The warriors who had been relaxed and welcoming now stood with their hands on their weapons, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Quanah's face was a mask of grim determination. He knew that Kane's arrival was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate provocation, a challenge to the fragile peace that had been forged between their two peoples. Kelly's mind raced. What was Kane's plan? What could he possibly hope to achieve by coming here to the heart of the Comanche nation? She didn't have to wait long for an answer. Kane rode into the camp not as a lone rider, but at the head of a small posse of heavily armed men. They were a motley crew of disgruntled settlers, their faces a mixture of fear and bravado. They were men who had been swayed by Kane's lies, men who saw the Comanche not as people, but as savages, as obstacles to their own greed and ambition. Kane reined in his horse in the center of the camp, his eyes sweeping over the assembled warriors with a look of contemptuous disdain. He saw Kelly standing next to Quanah, and a triumphant, sneering smile spread across his face. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. The witch and her savage friends. I knew you were a traitor, Kelly. I knew you were in league with them." Quanah stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his knife. "You are not welcome here, snake-tongue," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Kane laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the tense silence. "I'm not here to talk to you, savage. I'm here for her." He pointed a finger at Kelly. "She's a wanted woman, a fugitive from justice." He held up a piece of paper, a crudely written warrant. "This here is a warrant for her arrest, issued by the good people of Fort Griffin. She's accused of consorting with the enemy, of aiding and abetting a hostile tribe. She's to be taken to the fort for trial." Kelly's blood ran cold. It was a lie, of course, a fabrication. But in this lawless land, a piece of paper, no matter how flimsy, could be a death sentence. "That's a lie," she cried, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. "You forged that. You're a liar and a coward." Kane's smile widened. "Am I ask your friends here? They'll tell you. The word is out, Kelly. Everyone knows about you and your savage lovers. They're calling for your head back at the fort." He was playing a dangerous game, a game of brinkmanship, of calculated cruelty. He was trying to provoke a reaction, to incite a conflict that he could then use to justify his own actions. Quanah, however, was not a man to be so easily baited. He stood his ground, his eyes fixed on Kane's, a silent, deadly standoff. "She is under my protection," Quanah said, his voice a low, unwavering rumble. "You will not take her." Kane's face hardened. "Is that a challenge, savage? Are you willing to go to war for this white squaw?" The air crackled with tension. A single spark, a single wrong move would ignite a firestorm of violence. Kelly knew she had to do something. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let her presence be the cause of a war between two peoples. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "I will go with him," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Quanah turned to her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "No," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "You cannot. I have to," she said, her voice firm. "I will not be the cause of bloodshed. I will go to the fort. I will clear my name." She looked at Kane, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "But I will not go as your prisoner. I will go as a free woman, to face my accusers and to expose your lies." Kane was taken aback. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had expected fear tears, a desperate plea For mercy, he had not expected this courage, this defiance. He hesitated, his mind racing. To refuse her would be to expose his own cowardice, his own weakness. To accept would be to risk losing control of the situation, to risk having his lies exposed in a court of law. He made his decision. "Fine," he said, his voice a low, grudging growl. "Have it your way. But you will be under guard. And if you try to escape, you will be shot." He turned to his men. "We ride at dawn," he said. The posse dismounted, their presence a dark, ominous cloud in the heart of the Comanche camp. The night was a long one, a tense, sleepless vigil. Kelly sat by the fire in Quanah's teepee, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Comanche sat with her, a silent, comforting presence. "You are brave, Kelly," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "But you are also a fool." "I have to do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the only way." "There is always another way," he said. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering resolve. "You will not go alone." The next morning, as the sun began to cast its first pale light across the plains, Kelly prepared to leave. She stood before Comanche, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "For everything." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are our sister," he said. "We will not abandon you." As she walked towards Kane and his men, she saw a group of Comanche warriors mounting their ponies. They were a small, elite group of fighters, their faces painted for war. At their head was Comanche. Kane's face paled. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of fear and bluster. "What are you doing?" Comanche looked at him, his eyes cold and hard. "We are going to Fort Griffin," he said, his voice a low, unwavering promise, "to see that justice is done." Kane was trapped. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, his plan unraveling before his eyes. He had come to the Comanche camp expecting to find a weak, defenseless woman. He had found a queen with an army at her back. The serpent had struck, but he had underestimated his prey. And now he was the one who was caught in the coils of his own treachery. The long ride to Fort Griffin would be a journey into the heart of darkness, a journey from which not all of them would return. The journey to Fort Griffin unfolded under a vast, indifferent sky. It was a silent procession, a slow crawl across a landscape that offered no comfort. The sun, a merciless sovereign, reigned over the parched earth, baking the dust into a fine, choking powder that coated their clothes, their skin, their throats. The only sounds were the rhythmic, hypnotic plodding of hooves, the creak of worn leather, and the whisper of a hot wind that carried the scent of sage and distant rain that would never fall. This silence was a living thing, heavy with unspoken threats and simmering hatred. Kane and his posse rode as a tight, nervous cluster, a knot of fear and aggression. They were men out of their depth, their bravado from the Comanche camp having evaporated under the endless sky and the unnerving proximity of their escort. Their hands hovered near their holsters, their eyes darting constantly towards the warriors who flanked them. They saw only savages, a terrifying, unknowable force, and their fear curdled into a festering resentment directed at the woman they held responsible for their predicament, Kelly. She rode in their midst, a prisoner in all but name. Her hands were free, but the circle of hostile faces was a cage more binding than any rope. She could feel their eyes on her, a physical weight of accusation. Yet she held her head high, her spine straight. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, But her awareness was turned inward, a maelstrom of fear and resolve. Each mile brought her closer to a reckoning, a trial by lies, in a place where a woman's word, especially one tainted by association with the Comanche, was worth less than the dust on her boots. What chance did she have? The thought was a cold stone in her gut. But then she would feel the other presence on the plains, and the stone would warm with a defiant heat. Quanah and his warriors moved with the land, a stark contrast to the posse's rigid anxiety. They were a river flowing around the rocks of Cain's party, their movements fluid, economical, and imbued with a quiet power. They were a silent promise, a constant unnerving reminder to Cain that his authority was a fragile illusion. They did not speak to the white men, but their presence spoke volumes. It said, "She is not alone. Tread carefully." During the long hours in the saddle, small moments of connection passed between Kelly and her protectors. A young warrior might ride a little closer, offering her a drink from his water skin, with a silent nod. Another might point to a hawk, circling high above a shared, wordless appreciation for the wild beauty of their world. These were small gestures, but to Kelly they were lifelines. They were anchors in the swirling sea of her uncertainty, reminding her that she was not a traitor, not a witch, but a woman who had earned the respect of a proud and noble people. The nights were a tense, armed truce. The two groups camped 100 yards apart, their fires, like two wary eyes, staring at each other across a chasm of darkness and mistrust. Cain's men would huddle together, their talk low and venomous, their laughter harsh and brittle. Kelly was left to them a solitary figure on the edge of their firelight. But each night a warrior would emerge from the darkness, a silent invitation. She would cross the divide and join the Comanche circle. There the world transformed. The tension of the day melted away in the warmth of their fire. They treated her not as a liability or a curiosity, but as an honored guest, a sister. Quanah's wife, a woman whose name was Whispering Wind, would share her food with Kelly, her hands moving with a quiet grace as she offered roasted rabbit and flatbread cooked on hot stones. Takoda, his initial shyness forgotten, would lean against her tracing patterns on her dusty skirt. His presence a simple, profound comfort. Quanah would sit with her a silent, powerful presence. "You carry a heavy burden, Kelly," he said one night, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The young warrior whose name she learned was Little Fox translated softly, "I fear I have brought this burden upon you and your people." She confessed, her voice thick with emotion. Quanah looked at the fire, his profile etched in flickering orange light. "A burden shared is a burden halved. We do not walk this path for you. We walk it with you. There is a difference." He then looked directly at her, his dark eyes seeming to pierce through her fear to the core of her strength. "You showed us your heart. Now we show you ours. You will not face the snake tongue alone." On the third day, the fort appeared a jagged scar on the horizon. Fort Griffin. It was not the bastion of order and civilization she had imagined, but a sprawling, chaotic tinderbox of rough-hewn saloons, clapboard storefronts, and muddy, rutted streets. It was an outpost of desperation, a magnet for soldiers, buffalo hunters, gamblers, and drifters, all clinging to the edge of a wilderness that threatened to swallow them whole. The air hung thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and simmering violence. Justice here, Kelly knew, would not be blind. It would be for sale to the highest bidder, or swayed by the loudest voice. Their arrival was a spectacle, A ripple of curiosity turned into a wave of raw, ugly emotion as the townsfolk caught sight of the procession. A lone woman, her face smudged with dirt, but her expression defiant, surrounded by a posse of grim-faced men and shadowed by a fearsome war party of Comanche. It was a scene straight out of a fever dream. The crowd pressed in their faces a gallery of frontier prejudice. "There's the witch," a man yelled, his voice thick with drink. "Look at her riding with the red devils!" A woman shrieked, pulling her children close. Insults and threats flew like stones, a barrage of hatred that struck Kelly with physical force. She flinched, her carefully constructed composure threatening to crack. Kane, however, drank it in. The adulation of the mob was a tonic to his withered ego. He straightened in his saddle, his chest puffing out, transforming from a nervous coward into a conquering hero. He was no longer a liar and a failure. He was the town's protector, the man who had ridden into the savage wilderness and returned with the source of all their fears in tow. He led them through the jeering gauntlet to the commanding officer's headquarters, a squat, unadorned building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own authority. He dismounted with a flourish and stormed inside Kelly and Quanah, following the crowd parting before the chief's imposing presence. Major Abernathy was a man who looked as weary as the fort he commanded. He was grizzled, his face a road map of desert campaigns and political skirmishes. He sat behind a large oak desk, cluttered with maps and reports, a half-empty bottle of whiskey near his elbow. He looked up as Kane burst in. His eyes narrowed with a familiar, tired annoyance. Kane slapped the crude warrant down on the desk. "Major Abernathy," he announced, his voice ringing with self-righteous authority. "I've done my civic duty. I've brought you the traitor Kelly Collins and her savage accomplices. They are a clear and present danger to this fort and to every God-fearing soul in this territory. They must be dealt with, and swiftly." Abernathy did not look at the paper. His gaze traveled past Kane, lingering on Kelly's calm, resolute face, then on Quanah, who stood by the door, his arms crossed, a figure of immense and silent dignity. The major had seen men like Kane 100 times before. Small men puffed up with big ambitions and poisonous lies. He had also seen men like Quanah, and he knew the difference. "And who exactly might you be to be bringing me prisoners and declaring threats?" Abernathy asked, his voice a low, dry drawl that cut through Kane's bluster. Kane sputtered, taken aback. "I am Charles Kane, a respected prospector and landowner in this community." "Are you?" Abernathy leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He picked up a cold pipe from his desk, tapping it on the edge. "Funny. I've been in command of this fort for 5 years, Mr. Kane. I know the landowners, I know the prospectors, and I know the liars. I have never once had the displeasure of hearing your name. But I have heard of Quanah." He nodded respectfully towards the chief. "He is a man of his word, a leader who has sought peace when war was easier. And I have recently received a report," he tapped a stack of papers on his desk, "about a woman named Kelly, a woman who showed immense courage in the face of danger." He finally glanced down at the warrant, picking it up between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were a dead insect. A flicker of something between amusement and contempt crossed his face. "This piece of paper isn't worth the ink it's written on," he said, his voice flat. "It's a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. The signature of the magistrate is spelled wrong." Kane's face, which had been flushed with pride, turned a mottled shade of purple. The foundation of his authority, the very basis of his righteous crusade, had crumbled to dust. "This is an outrage!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. She's a traitor, a witch. Can't you see? She has bewitched you all." Abernathy sighed, a long, weary sound of a man burdened by the endless foolishness of others. "Mr. Kane," he said, his voice losing its drawl and taking on a hard, steely edge. "You are a fool, a liar, and you are a danger to the fragile peace I am tasked with maintaining in this territory. By bringing a war party to my doorstep under false pretenses, you have endangered every man, woman, and child in this fort. I am placing you under arrest for inciting violence, bearing false witness, and for being a damnable nuisance." He jerked his head towards the door. "Sergeant, take this man to the stockade. Let him cool his heels for a month. Maybe sometime breaking rocks will improve his character." 2 burly soldiers stepped forward. Kane's men, who had been listening from the doorway, faded back into the crowd, their loyalty as flimsy as Kane's warrant. Kane stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage as the soldiers grabbed his arms and hauled him away, his protests lost in the murmur of the dispersing crowd. Silence descended on the office. Abernathy poured himself a measure of whiskey and gestured towards another glass for Quanah, who declined with a slight shake of his head. The Major looked at Kelly, a new respect dawning in his tired eyes. "My sincere apologies for the misunderstanding, ma'am," he said. "It seems we have a mutual and powerful interest in maintaining the peace." Quanah stepped forward, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. "We are a people of peace," he said, Little Fox translating with quiet pride. "But we are also a people of war. We will do what is necessary to protect our own." His gaze shifted to Kelly, and his expression was filled with an unwavering, fierce admiration that resonated deeper than any words of praise. "She is one of us now. An attack on her is an attack on the Comanche nation." Abernathy looked from the powerful chief to the solitary woman and understood. She was no longer just a widow struggling on the frontier. She was a bridge, a linchpin, a symbol of a hope he had long thought lost in this harsh land. "You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Collins," he said, the formality, a mark of his profound respect. A small smile touched Kelly's lips, the first genuine smile in days. It felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. "It's just Kelly," she said, her voice clear and strong. The serpent had been defanged, its venom rendered harmless not by force of arms, but by the unshakable power of truth. The long, dusty road to justice had ended here in this shabby office with an alliance forged in the crucible of one man's hatred and one woman's courage. The future remained an unwritten page, but for the first time, Kelly did not have to face it alone. She was a part of a story larger than herself, a story of a peace that was as wild and as precious as the land itself. The legend of Kelly and Quanah became a whisper on the plains, a story told around campfires and in the quiet moments before sleep. It was a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, in the crucible of fear and prejudice, the human heart can find a way to connect, to understand, to love. Kelly's story is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the extraordinary courage of an ordinary woman. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, to be shared, to be a beacon of hope in a world that too often forgets the simple, profound truth that we are all, in the end, one tribe. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in your soul, then please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the unsung heroes of the American West. Let's keep their legacies alive, one story at a time.